Okay, on to next review. It's going to be Heroes of Last Resort, the other guy's book number one, written by J.K. Galiotto and C.K. Nospe. Nosp. Anyways, sorry. It's going to be 320 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. Jack Jensen is a middle-aged nobody who lives a lackluster life in an even more uninteresting town. Having sampled every job the small town of Merrill, Wisconsin has to offer, he has excelled at nothing but growing his beer gut and his luxurious, curly, chestnut brown hair. His life is one of unrealized potential and lack of direction. Things change one morning when his brother, an army major, lands his helicopter in the parking lot of Jack's less than profitable gaming store in his desperate bid to thrust the perennial slacker into the role of saving the country, the world, and even more unlikely, himself. So there we go. That's actually a pretty good novel description, novel blurb. The opening, however, not as good. That's honestly the hardest part about the story is the prelude section and the beginning, like 20% of the story. But if you push past it, it's an entertaining story. It really is. It gets better as the story goes on. I feel like it's mostly because the authors figure out what they want this story to be. They start giving it a sort of a plot. They start figuring out a balance between the game mechanics and writing and action adventure stuff. And they just find their pacing eventually. It just takes a good while, unfortunately. The opening, honestly, a little off-putting. It didn't quite make sense why the military couldn't send well-trained soldiers into the otherworldly portal, and a regular guy could just because he played games. And this is probably the point that I've seen noted several negative reviews on the book, where like, that doesn't make sense. Click, I'm not reading anymore. And that's totally valid. If that's your experience, I understand what I felt like. I was like, this seems like an awfully convoluted premise to get this guy into the RPG game world. In my brain, I'm like, from a writing perspective, I'm like, not needed at all. Like, you could seriously skip the entire like prelude section, jump into chapter 1, and it would feel like a better story, because in the prelude, in the beginning portion of it, you're kind of ruining what we're going to see from this world. I much prefer, personally, just experiencing it along with the main character as he's going to this new place, and the majesty and the discovery of what the races are and what the game mechanics are, and just seeing it up close and personal from his point of view. Instead, you get like this tell me instead of a show me. And I was like, oh, okay, that's a choice. And again, even in like the character creation section, there's a lot of like 80s pop culture. And personally, I'm cool with like some of them. They're funny, but there are a ton in this opening section. And it felt like the authors are just like, oh, we got to put these in because it's a little PG. And I've read Ready Player One, or I've read a bunch of stories where there are pop culture references. And it's valid to think that there's that sense of cultural expression, but it's mostly because guys my age are writing stories. We're like, we grew up in the 80s, so of course we're going to make these references. But there's like so much in the beginning, it's like, oh, a little overwhelming. And the same thing can be said for some of the game mechanics, and that I love game mechanics. I love getting information and I love notifications, but sometimes in the beginning, like 20% of the story, it felt like it was like half the story. We're just like, bam, 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 game mechanics. I bandage myself and I get 7 choices, or probably like 4. But it's literally like a page long of notifications or 2 of like, oh, these are game text. I'm like, oh, and then he starts a fire, another couple pages. I'm like, oh, that's probably a little bit too much. And you can tell the authors probably felt the same way, because as the story progresses past the 30, 40, 50% mark, that disappears to a degree, or at least it's bundled. There are longer sections between those things, where it's like, oh, main characters, instead of game notifications, like damage notifications popping up during a fight, or like having a couple pages of damage notifications, it's like, oh, they disappear for most of the story after a while. And you see fewer pages and pages worth of game notifications, level notifications, and choices to make for bonuses to skills or whatever. And you get more adventure, you get more dialogue, you get more action stuff that's not interrupted by those things, because the authors kind of find their balance as to what works for them as storytellers. And so you can kind of see that progression of the story as it goes along, which is why I say, oh, go past the start. It does get better if the beginning just feels off-putting. So there you go. It's actually more of a slice of life story where the main character goes on adventures, does some quests. It's not super plot driven in that even though the premise is there, and it doesn't really need it because the fun happens when the main character is going on adventures, exploring things, exploring what his class options are, exploring the skills he can possibly learn, interacting with fantasy characters, goblins, halflings, whatever, and just fighting and bringing other players, his other friends from the real world into the world. Through whatever mechanics are there. I don't want to spoil things. But the game mechanics and story, they're there. This is absolute RPG. All the mechanics are going to feel familiar to you if you're a little bit reader or a gamer or a tabletop player. You can kind of tell that the authors are pulling more for tabletop stuff than game stuff, even though there are other game mechanics thrown in there. But you can really see from the character creation section to like how the skills kind of unfold and the choices of multi-classing the main character eventually makes, that it's really pulling more from tabletop experiences. But good stuff, mostly around a lot of good class theorizing. Like I said, plenty of notifications, especially in the early section. But even the skill choices are like, oh, this eventually matters. Like the character is making an interesting character as he's progressing. So good stuff there. Again, story wise, beginning's a little rough. Doesn't have much focus. Overly complicated opening and premise, which really doesn't need to exist if you're just trying to get the main character to the story world, but that's all it really exists for. And again, just kind of does some stuff, does campfire, bandaging, cooking. Early part of the story is a little rougher, but once you get into 30-40% of the novel, the story finds some focus. He gets some friends to come with him from the real, so the banter and the dialogue gets better. The action gets better. You get a little bit of a point of like, oh, this is their goal, and you can see them progressing on it story wise. And so the story just shows how the authors are progressing as storytellers as it goes on. So there you go. Overall, decent story. Again, it does take a while for the authors to find their footing, but it does happen as they lean more into the action adventures. So it gets a score of 7.3 out of 10 for me. Heroes of the Last Resort, the other guy's book, number 1, with a score of, again, 7.3 out of 10.